She hid her face behind a bonnet. But the Apache lifted her chin and braided her hair like she was scared. The first time he saw her, she was more bonnet than face, a small figure at the edge of the trading post yard, with her chin buried so deeply in shadow that the sun never touched her skin. She moved carefully, almost apologetically, as if afraid to take up more space than the worn boards beneath her boots would allow. Men came and went, their voices rough with business and weather, and she kept to the far side of the rail with a basket tucked against her stomach like a shield. Even when spoken to, she answered with her head turned, letting the brim hide the angles of her cheeks, the curve of her mouth. He noticed not because she demanded attention, but because she tried so hard not to. The Apache man had come to trade pelts and tobacco, his presence drawing the usual mix of stares and distance, yet his gaze kept drifting back to the girl who seemed determined to make herself smaller. A gust of wind blew dust across the yard, lifting the edge of her bonnet just enough for him to catch a glimpse of her eyes, startled, quick, then immediately hidden again. In that instant, he saw not plainness or flaw, but a practiced reflex, the kind that comes from being told too often that looking up is dangerous. When a man near the porch muttered something about one of those girls better off under a hat, she flinched almost imperceptibly, fingers tightening on the basket handle. No one defended her. No one challenged the comment. The words slid into the dust like they'd been said many times before. He finished his trade, accepted his coins, and could have ridden away with his bundle secured and his heart left untouched. Instead, he lingered by the hitching rail, watching as she finally approached the small counter to buy flour and salt. The shopkeeper didn't meet her eyes either, addressing the brim as if it were the person. She paid, nodded, and turned to leave, her bonnet catching another gust. This time it slipped a little farther back, revealing a face that looked more tired than anything else, and in that tiredness he recognized something familiar. A person who had learned to move through the world as though apologizing for having a face at all. He did not speak to her then. He only watched as she walked away down the road, bonnet pulled low once more, and wondered what kind of house had taught her to hide so thoroughly from daylight. Her family's cabin squatted low against the edge of the valley, more patch than structure, its walls carrying the stale echo of words that had never been meant as cruelty and yet had cut just the same. Inside, her mother's voice held the weary sharpness of a woman who had learned to survive by arranging the world in order of usefulness. "Pull that brim down," she'd say whenever visitors passed or whenever the light caught the girl's face the wrong way. "No need to show what won't win you anything." Her sisters, prettier by the town's measure, practiced their smiles in the small, cloudy mirror, while she learned to adjust ribbons so the bonnet shadow fell just right. No one called her ugly outright, at least not often. Instead, they used softer phrases that bruised instead of bleeding. "She's a good girl, just not much to look at," or "some folks aren't meant to be noticed." These comments stacked up inside her like firewood, heavy and weighting and over. Time she came to believe that hiding was the kindest thing she could do for everyone. When future husbands were discussed over mending and washing, her name rarely entered the conversation unless as an afterthought. "Maybe someone quiet, someone who doesn't mind," always said with the tone of settling. She pretended not to hear, focused on her stitching, but each word stitched itself into her anyway. On the day she saw the Apache at the trading post, she had woken with the familiar resolve to move through town unnoticed, brim low, eyes down, voice soft. She did not expect anyone to see her, truly see her, least of all one of the men people whispered about in fear. Back at the cabin, after the trading trip, her mother barely looked up when she entered, only waved toward the shelf where the flour belonged. Her father commented on the price, her sisters on the fashions they had glimpsed, no one asking how the road felt or how the day had sat in her chest. That night, as she unpinned her bonnet and set it on the peg, she caught her reflection in the poor glass, eyes dull from being avoided, mouth trained into a line that knew how to stay quiet. She touched the brim with something like gratitude and something like grief. It had become both prison and protection, the only thing between her and a world she believed did not want to look at her. She did not know that someone already had and had seen something entirely different. The next time their paths crossed, the trading post yard was quieter, the sun lower, stretching shadows long across the rutted ground. She had come later in the day, hoping fewer eyes would be there to weigh her as she bought the items her mother had listed. He was there too, having returned sooner than usual, with word that more settlers meant more goods to exchange. From where he stood near his horse, he watched her approach, bonnet once again drawn like a curtain, hands folded around a small wrapped bundle. This time, instead of keeping his distance, he stepped aside to hold the door as she entered the store. She startled, almost walking into the frame, having not expected anyone to be that close. For a fleeting heartbeat, the brim tilted back and their eyes met fully. What he saw made him pause, not plainness, not flaw, but a quick flare of panic, followed by practiced withdrawal, as though being seen was a danger she'd been warned about all her life. He nodded in greeting, offering a simple "ma'am," his voice low and even. She mumbled a thank you, cheeks flushing beneath the shadow, and slipped past him inside. While she bartered for coffee and a small length of thread, he pretended to study a sack of grain, listening instead to the way she never quite lifted her chin when speaking, how she kept turning her shoulders slightly away from the clerk, as if trying to reduce the amount of face visible at any given moment. When she finished and stepped back outside, she nearly collided with a group of boys roughhousing near the steps. One of them jostled her hard enough that her bonnet slipped sideways, exposing her hair, thick, ordinary brown, braided too tightly against her head. "Watch it," one boy snapped, more annoyed at the interruption than anything. Another snickered, muttering, "Should keep that thing on, you're better that way." Before being pulled off by a half-hearted scolding, she fumbled the bonnet back into place so fast she almost stabbed herself with the pin. The Apache saw all of it, the careless words, the way her fingers trembled, the way no one thought the moment worth noticing. He felt an old, familiar anger at how casually some people let their tongues bruise what their hands never had to mend. He did not confront the boys. Instead, he stepped near enough that his presence formed a small shield between her and the yard, offering his horse's side as a brief barrier. "Road's clear now," he said quietly. "Take your time." She nodded again without really looking up, but for the briefest instant, as she stepped past, the brim lifted just enough for him to see a question flicker there. Why would you bother? It was a question he did not yet know how to answer in words, but he found himself thinking about it long after she disappeared down the trail. Rumors travel faster than wagons, and it wasn't long before he heard that the girl under the bonnet had no suitors waiting, no promises made, and a family already speaking as though she were a problem to be solved before winter. The trader mentioned it in passing, not unkindly. Shame about that one, sweet enough, just not the sort men line up for, as if he were discussing a dented piece of tin. The Apache did not respond, but the words lodged in his chest beside the memory of fearful eyes and hurried fingers. That night, back in camp by a small fire, he thought of the women who had shaped him, his grandmother, his aunt, the widowed cousin who had taken him in after his sickness, took too many at once. None of them would have survived a world that measured worth by first glances. They had taught him that a good wife was a steady hearth, a clear mind, hands that did not turn away from hard work or from tenderness. Beauty had never been absent in his people. It simply had never been the first question. The next time he came to the valley, it was not only for trade. He asked a few careful questions, listening more to what was not said. Some shrugged and said she would be grateful for anyone. Others smirked and said any man willing to take her would be doing the family a kindness. He ignored both sets of voices. When he finally approached her father, it was with calm simplicity. He did not dress his interest in pity or charity. He spoke of land and winters, of the need for partnership, of the kind of life he intended to build. The older man, surprised, looked him over and then asked the question most people thought first. "You seen her proper?" The Apache answered truthfully. "I've seen enough to know she walks like she expects to be in the way. I would ask her to walk beside me." It was not the answer the father sought, but the offer met his need. The agreement was made with more relief than celebration. When they told her, it was in the language of arrangement, not of blessing. "He'll have you, and he's decent enough. Could be worse." That night, alone in the small room with the worn mirror, she stared at her reflection, at the bonnet hanging on its peg. She had expected, if marriage ever came, that it would be because someone had run out of better choices. She did not yet know that somewhere, by a fire under open sky, A man was thinking not of what he was settling for, but of how to help her one day step out from under that brim without fear. The morning they left her family's cabin, the sky was a soft, undecided gray, the color of days that could become either storm or blessing. She stood on the small porch with her bundle tied neatly, bonnet pulled low, aware of her sisters watching from the doorway and her mother busying herself with a chore that did not need doing. There were no long farewells. Her father shook the Apache's hand, thanked him in the practical tone of a man who believed he had solved a problem, then muttered a warning about the hard country beyond the ridge. No one asked how she felt. No one asked if she was afraid. And so she folded her fear the way she folded linens, small, square, tucked away. The Apache adjusted the cinch on his horse, then turned to her with a nod that wasn't commanding. It was inviting. "We'll ride slow," he said simply. She climbed onto the wagon bench, hands tight on the reins, bonnet brim framing a narrow view of the world. The road wound upward, dust, whispering under the wheels, the valley leaning back behind them. For a long while, neither spoke. He did not fill the silence with reassurances, and somehow that steadiness felt safer than any speech. As they passed the low creek crossing, he pointed to where the current braided around stones, explaining which spots turned dangerous in heavy rain. He did not say this to impress her or to frighten her. He included her, as though assuming she would be part of such decisions now. When they stopped at midday beneath a lone pine, he handed her bread and dried meat, then sat a respectful distance away, letting the quiet rest between them. A pair of hawks circled overhead. She watched them with something like envy, wondering what it would feel like to move through the open sky without wondering who wished you would hide. After they ate, he surprised her by asking if she would like to walk a stretch beside the wagon. "To loosen the worry from your bones." The phrasing startled her. No one had ever noticed worry lived in her body. She agreed, and together they walked a while, boots scuffing in rhythm. He told her small things, the names of plants, the bends in the trail ahead, the sound of a distant spring. He did not talk about her face, did not praise or critique, and the absence of judgment felt like sunlight slipping in under a closed door. By late afternoon, the path narrowed into the foothills where his country began. The land opened differently here, broader and quieter, as if the earth itself breathed slower. She felt the weight of the bonnet tug at her scalp and adjusted it out of habit, then stopped, aware that no one but him was near enough to notice. He saw the motion, said nothing, only gave the smallest nod of understanding as if to say, "We will take this slowly." And for the first time, the space between them felt like possibility instead of scrutiny. By the time they reached his homestead, late sunlight poured across the clearing like a quiet welcome. The house stood simple but well kept, timbers fitted tight, roof mended with care. Nearby, a line of corn bowed in the evening breeze, and beyond it, the hills rose like watchful shoulders. She stepped down from the wagon, bonnet still low, expecting the familiar prickle of judgment that always came when entering a new space. But the yard did not seem to weigh her. No sharp eyes waited in the doorway. No whispered appraisal hovered in the air. The Apache carried their things inside first, setting them down as though each object already had a place. When he returned, he asked, almost shyly, whether she would like to see the rooms herself, or walk together. She chose together, grateful not to be left wandering in someone else's life. Inside, everything bore the quiet mark of intention, cooking pots arranged by usefulness rather than display, a table smoothed by years of hands, a itas shelf with carved figures from his childhood. He showed her where he kept the flour, where rain leaked during heavy storms, where the floorboard near the door creaked in winter. Each detail came with an explanation, as though he were offering her not just a house, but participation in its keeping. When he led her to the small room that would be theirs, she hesitated at the threshold. Weddings, in her experience, turned bedrooms into places of expectation and comparison. But all she saw here was a bed with a clean quilt, a washstand, and a window that caught the western light. He asked if the window should stay open or closed at night, the simplest question, yet it opened something wide in her chest. She answered, and he nodded, filing the information away with care. That evening, after supper, she stepped outside alone for a moment, needing air. A breeze lifted the ribbon under her chin and tugged lightly at the bonnet brim. Instinctively, she pressed it down. Behind her, he spoke, from the porch, voice soft enough not to startle. "You don't have to hide here." She froze, not hurt, just exposed, unsure how to answer. He didn't move closer. He didn't insist. "When you're ready," he added. "Not before." The kindness in those words startled her more than any declaration could have. Later, as darkness gathered and crickets took up their chorus, she hung the bonnet on a peg near the door, hands lingering on the ribbon. For a heartbeat, she thought she might leave it there. Then, out of habit, she took it with her to bed. But as she lay beneath the quilt, listening to the creak beyond the window, she realized that for the first time in years, she had not fallen asleep rehearsing apologies. Instead, she drifted into dreams shaped by the quiet possibility that a life might exist where her face was not a problem to be solved, only a part of her that could one day be seen without fear. Morning came bright and gentle, the kind of light that slips through curtains like a whisper instead of a command. She sat at the edge of the bed, bonnet in her lap, fingers tracing the ribbon out of habit. Her hair, freshly washed the night before, hung loose down her back, a rare thing she usually avoided, because loose hair meant exposure, and exposure invited comments she had learned never to forget. She reached automatically to twist it into the severe braid her mother had taught her, but her hands paused halfway, as if they had suddenly remembered something new. There was no audience here, waiting to judge. Still, when she stepped into the main room, instinct took over, and she lifted the bonnet, poised to hide. The Apache was mending a strap at the table. He looked up and stopped, not because he was startled by her, but because he seemed to choose his next actions carefully. He set the strap aside, stood, and came a few steps closer without crowding her. "May I?" he asked quietly, gesturing toward the chair by the window, not her hair. The invitation felt like a bridge. Unsure, she sat. Only then did he kneel slightly to be level with her, and with the same calm he used when gentling a frightened horse, he lifted his hand, not to touch, but to hover. "If I'm wrong," he said, "tell me. I won't be hurt." The words loosened something behind her ribs. After a small nod from her, he placed 2 fingers beneath her chin and gently raised it, not high, not exposing, just enough so her face met the morning light instead of the bonnet's shadow. The world did not collapse. The walls did not whisper. He did not gasp or grimace. He simply looked, not at flaws, but at a person. "There," he murmured, as if he'd opened a shutter and let sunlight into a room long closed. Then, moving around behind her, he took a comb from the shelf, the one he used to untangle rope fibers, cleaned, smooth, familiar in his hands. "Where I come from," he said softly. "Braiding means care. You braid things you don't want to lose." His fingers worked patiently, gathering her hair not like something to control, but like something to guide with respect. He wove each strand with the steadiness of a man who knew that rushing breaks what should simply be tended. No flourishes, no performative tenderness, just presence. At first, she sat rigid, waiting for the shame to arrive like always. But as the braid formed, she felt something else. The surprising realization that he handled her hair the same way he handled important tools, not because they were pretty, but because they were necessary, worthy of attention. When he finished, he tied the end with a strip of leather, stepped around, and, crucially, did not force her chin up this time. Instead, he said, "If you want the bonnet, wear it. If you don't, the world can learn to face you." She touched the braid. It felt like belonging, and for the first time, she lowered the bonnet back to the peg, not out of rebellion, but because hiding suddenly felt like the stranger in the room. They needed flour that week, and a few lengths of wire for the fence so the trip to town could not be avoided. In the past, such errands had filled her with a dread that began the moment the wagon wheels touched the road, because town meant eyes, and eyes meant quiet verdicts. This time, though, as she stood beside the wagon fastening her shawl, she reached automatically for the bonnet, and then stopped, fingers suspended in the air. The braid lay against her back, neat and steady, the leather tie resting at its end like a small, deliberate promise. She could have worn the bonnet anyway. No one would have questioned it, but she remembered the way he had lifted her chin only after asking, the way he had stepped back and let the choice remain hers. Slowly, she lowered her hand and climbed onto the seat. He noticed, but he did not smile in triumph. He simply nodded once, as though acknowledging a decision made between equals. The ride into town was quiet, the air crisp, the hills washed in the clarity that comes after rain. As they rolled into the square, she felt the old tension tighten, her shoulders wanting to curl, her gaze wanting to drop. Instead, she breathed in and sat straight, the braid resting like a hand between her shoulder blades. Some people looked, as people always do. A few blinked in mild surprise, perhaps realizing they had never actually seen her face before. But the stares did not slice the way they once had. They drifted over her like weather. At the general store, the clerk paused, then recovered, treating her with the same measured politeness he offered everyone else. She asked for what she needed clearly, even asked a question about the wire gauge, and when he answered, she nodded thoughtfully instead of just agreeing. No one laughed, no one muttered. It was not that the world had suddenly become kind, it was that she no longer approached it apologizing. Outside, she noticed a young girl watching her from the porch, bonnet drawn, low in a way that felt painfully familiar. Their eyes met for a second. The girl's hand twitched toward her brim, ready to hide further. Instead, seeing the braid, she hesitated, then let the brim rest where it was. The moment was small and passed quickly, but it lodged in her heart like a seed. On the ride home, the Apache asked only one question. How did the day feel? She thought about it. Then she answered simply, like breathing. He nodded, satisfied, not needing her to make a speech about bravery. By the time the sun leaned west and their cabin came into view, she realized the world had not changed at all. What had changed was the way she met it, unhidden, unashamed, not louder, just present. And presence, she learned, was its own kind of strength. It was late afternoon when the wagon appeared on the ridge, familiar wheels, familiar voices, and she knew before the dust settled that her family had come. Her stomach tightened with an old reflex, memories of mirrors and murmured comparisons rising uninvited. The Apache stepped from the barn, not wary, simply steady, and waited beside her as the wagon rolled into the yard. Her mother climbed down first, eyes sweeping the cabin, the yard, the fields, not unkind, but searching for proof of hardship, for signs that this life was too big for the daughter she'd once measured so small. Her father nodded to the Apache, offered a curt greeting, then turned to her with a look she had seen countless times, a look that assessed before it welcomed. For a moment she almost reached for the bonnet peg in her mind. Then she felt the weight of the braid against her back, a quiet reminder, and she simply stood as she was. They went inside for coffee. Her mother talked about town news, her sister's prospects, the price of fabric. Between sentences came the gentle probes. Are you lonely up here? Is it too quiet? Do you ever wish? Each question carried the old assumption that her life must be something endured, not chosen. Once she would have agreed just to stay safe. Today, she answered honestly, describing the work, the evenings by the creek, the sense of belonging that arrived without applause. She did not try to convince them. She simply told the truth. Her mother blinked, as if the words did not quite fit the daughter she remembered. Then, inevitably, came the remark, soft, meant to sound like affection. Marriage has been kind to you. You look better than you used to. A younger version of herself would have shrunk under that compliment with its sharp underside. Instead, she smiled, not defensively, not wounded, and said, Marriage didn't change my face. It changed how I live inside it. The room went still for a moment. Her father cleared his throat, uncomfortable not because she had been rude, but because she had spoken like someone who owned her life. The Apache said nothing, yet his quiet pride filled the space between them like a warm draft. When they left near sunset, her mother hugged her longer than expected, murmuring, You seem settled. The word caught in her heart like a blessing that didn't quite know how to shape itself. As the wagon disappeared over the ridge, she realized something subtle. She felt no need for their approval, but she held no bitterness either. The past had not vanished. It had simply lost its authority. Standing in the doorway, braid brushing her shoulder, she understood that she had not escaped her old world by hiding. She had outgrown it by being seen. Autumn rolled in with a quiet gold, laying soft light across the fields and marking the passing of a year she could hardly recognize as her own. She stood one morning at the doorway, cleaning the last of the harvest dust from her hands, when she noticed the bonnet still hanging on its peg by the door, the same place she had left it the night she first slept in this house. It had become part of the wall, more memory than garment. She took it down, turning it over in her hands, surprised by how light it felt now. Once, it had been armor. Now it looked like something that belonged to a much younger version of herself, a girl who believed hiding was a kindness she owed the world. The Apache came up from the shed carrying tools, paused when he saw the bonnet in her hands, and waited, as was his way, for her to speak first. She lifted her eyes to him and smiled softly. "I used to think this kept people from seeing me," she said. "But I think it mostly kept me from seeing life." He nodded, not pressing for more, as though he understood that some realizations are meant to sit quietly rather than be examined. Together they walked to the creek, where leaves floated past like small, colorful farewells. She knelt and dipped the bonnet into the cool water, watching it darken, then laid it on a sun-warmed rock to dry, not as a farewell ceremony, not as rebellion, simply as an acknowledgement that it had done its job and was no longer needed. On the way back, she slipped her hand into his, not shyly, not apologetically, just because it felt natural. That evening, as they sat by the fire, he spoke of plans for the next season, fence repairs, a bigger garden, perhaps chickens if winter allowed. He asked for her thoughts first, and when she offered them, he listened as though she were another compass he trusted. Later, before bed, she brushed out her hair by lamplight, unbraiding the careful weave he had made that first morning and rebraiding it herself. Slower, with the same patience he had shown her. The leather tie at the end felt like a signature she now knew how to write. Lying beneath the quilt, she realized that she rarely thought about whether she was beautiful, not because she had finally answered the question, but because the question had faded, replaced by better ones. Am I honest? Am I kind? Am I living the life I was given with both hands open? And as night settled gently across the hills, she understood that true love had not taught her to dazzle the world. It had taught her to stand in it, chin lifted, eyes steady, unhidden, unashamed, and wholly alive. Some people hide because the world taught them to. Others stop hiding because someone finally shows them they don't have to. He didn't lift her chin to fix her. He lifted it so she could see how fully she already belonged. And when he braided her hair, he was saying, "You are not something to cover. You are something to care for.